Welcome to Singapore Property Talk Law, your one-stop shop to figure out Singapore real estate. I'm Damien, and I'm thrilled to have our real estate guru, Serene, here today, ready to help you guys prep for the Real Estate Salesperson Paper 1 exam.
Absolutely. Hey, everyone, I'm Serene, and yeah, I'm here to help you nail those key concepts, and, maybe we'll uncover a few surprises along the way.
Awesome. So before we dive into the crazy world of property types and legal stuff, let's tackle the big question. What makes Singapore's real estate market so unique? What are those fundamental forces that make it tick?
Great question. I think the best place to start is that Singapore's real estate scene is super fascinating because it's shaped by this crazy tension between limited land and massive demand.
So it's not like your average investment playground, right?
Not at all. Think about every single property in Singapore, from those tiny HDB flats to those massive good class bungalows, sits on a piece of land that's finite, right? And that scarcity just drives up the value like crazy.
Basic economics, but with a Singaporean twist.
Exactly. And it's not even just about the land itself. Imagine a new MRT line gets announced and boom, suddenly properties along that line become gold mines.
That's what we call the ripple effect of improvements, right? You get a new mall, a park, even a fancy new school, and bam, property values skyrocket.
You got it. And those improvements, especially infrastructure like MRT lines or expressways, they create a sense of permanence that really anchors property values.
So location's key, but it's also about anticipating future developments and how those ripples will shape the market. It makes sense. But, with all this talk about sky-high values, it's easy to get caught up in the investment hype. What are some realities aspiring real estate professionals should be prepared to discuss with their clients?
That's where it gets interesting. First, let's ditch that get-rich-quick mindset. Real estate in Singapore is a long game. Unlike stocks, you can't just buy and sell properties on a whim. It's a lot less liquid, and those transaction costs can add up fast. Stamp duties, legal fees, agent commissions, it all adds up.
Patience is key in this market, and understanding those hidden costs is crucial for advising clients, right?
Absolutely. Another key concept is supply inelasticity. You can't just magically build new condos overnight to meet a sudden surge in demand. Building takes time, approvals take time, and that lag can really impact prices.
So the market can be pretty volatile, especially when demand outstrips supply.
Exactly. And while we're talking about liquidity, it's worth mentioning REITs for investors who want a more flexible approach.
REITs, those real estate investment trusts, they offer a way to get into the property market without the hassle of owning physical property, right?
Exactly. They provide diversification, professional management, and they're traded on the stock exchange so you can buy and sell easily. Plus, remember that 90% income distribution requirement in Singapore, that makes REITs super attractive for income-seeking investors.
So we've got the basics down. Scarce land ripple effects, the long game of investment, and even a peek into the world of REITs. Now let's jump into the exciting world of Singapore's different property types. We've got a whole range from HDB flats to those legendary good-class bungalow.
It's a jungle out there, don't worry, we'll break it down. Let's start with the big categories, residential and non-residential.
Residential's where it's at, right? HDB flats, condos, landed properties, it's where most Singaporeans live.
Speaking of landed property, let's talk about those good-class bungalows for a second. Did you know they're subject to this fascinating bungalow belt rule? It restricts development to specific prime areas, making them even more exclusive.
Wow, that's super interesting. It's like a secret society of luxurious homes.
Exactly. Now, moving on to other landed properties, we've got your semi-detached houses, your terrace houses, each with its own unique characteristics and, of course, price points.
And then there are townhouses and cluster houses. They've got strata titles like condos, but are classified as restricted properties for foreigners.
That's a crucial distinction. Foreign ownership restrictions are a big deal in Singapore, especially for landed properties. Understanding those nuances is key.
So even though those townhouses and cluster houses might seem like condos, they operate under a different set of rules.
Now let's move on to non-landed private properties. We've got condos and apartments, the bread and butter of urban living for many Singaporeans.
Aren't those like the same thing?
Not exactly. Condos are like the fancy older sibling. They're all about lifestyle amenities, gyms, pools, tennis courts, you name it. They usually have 247 security and are located in those central desirable areas.
So condos are for those who want the full package, while apartments are more budget-friendly?
Exactly. Apartments are more about affordability, offering the essentials without all the fancy extras.
It's all about finding the right fit for your lifestyle and budget. Now, we can't talk about Singapore property without mentioning HDB flats.
Ah, yes, the HDB flats, those iconic symbols of affordable housing. Did you know a whopping 82% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats?
It's amazing how HDB has shaped not just the physical landscape of Singapore, but its social fabric, too. Those flats come in all sorts of sizes and layouts, catering to a wide range of needs and budgets.
And then you've got those interesting hybrids, the executive condominiums or ECs. They're like the middle child between HDB flats and private condos, developed and sold by private developers, but with eligibility criteria similar to HDB flats.
So they offer a bit of that condo lifestyle, but with certain restrictions, right?
Exactly. For the first 5 years, you can only sell an EC to Singapore citizens or permanent residents. After 10 years, they become fully privatized and can be sold on the open market.
It's like a stepping stone to full private property ownership.
Precisely. And don't forget about DBSS flats, design, build, and sell scheme flats. They're like HDB flats, but with a touch more luxury, boasting upgraded finishes and designs, but still under the public housing umbrella.
Wow, so much to unpack here, from the unique characteristics of each property type to those restrictions and eligibility criteria.
It's all about mastering those details. Now that we've explored those different types of Singapore properties, let's look at the forces that shape the market: supply and demand.
Ah, the classic economic dance. I'm all ears.
It's all about understanding that delicate balance between how much property is available and how many people want to buy it.
So we have buyer's markets and seller's markets, right? It's like a seesaw tipping back and forth depending on which side has more weight.
That's a great analogy. In a buyer's market, sellers might have to lower prices to attract buyers, while in a seller's market, it's a race to the top as buyers outbid each other.
So understanding those market dynamics is key for advising clients on when to buy, when to sell, and how to negotiate the best deals.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to supply, the government plays a big role in Singapore. We've got the Urban Redevelopment Authority, URA, the HDB for public housing, and JTC Corporation for industrial land, all carefully managing land releases to ensure sustainable development.
Like a well-choreographed ballet with the government controlling the stage and the developers performing their parts.
And on the demand side, location is king. People are willing to pay top dollar for properties in desirable areas with good schools, amenities, and transport links. Tenure is another big factor, whether the property is freehold, meaning you own the land forever, or leasehold, which is for a fixed period, typically 99 years.
Freehold properties are usually more expensive, but leasehold properties can still be a good investment if you understand the nuances.
Right. And of course, the age and condition of the property matter. A brand new condo with a killer view will command a higher price than an older rundown apartment in a less desirable location.
It's all about weighing those factors against your budget and investment goals. Now, I'm curious about how all this plays out in different parts of the market. You mentioned submarkets earlier. What are those all about?
Great question. Think of submarkets as specialized niches within the broader real estate market. We've got the residential submarket, which we've been talking about. Then there's the commercial submarket encompassing offices, retail spaces, and hotels. And finally, we have the industrial submarket with factories, warehouses, and logistics facilities.
So each submarket has its own set of dynamics and factors that influence its performance. A good salesperson needs to understand each one to effectively advise their clients.
Absolutely. Now, we've covered a lot from the basics of scarcity and demand to the different property types and the dynamics of submarkets. But there's one crucial layer we need to explore: the legal framework that underpins every property transaction in Singapore.
Ah, the legal stuff. It can be a bit intimidating, but I'm ready to unravel those complexities. What are some key legal concepts that aspiring salespeople need to grasp?
That's what we'll dive into next. Remember, in Singapore, all land ultimately belongs to the state. So when you buy a property, you're acquiring an estate in land, which outlines the type of ownership rights you have.
And those rights come in two main flavors: freehold and leasehold right. Freehold means you own the land forever, while leasehold is for a fixed period.
You got it. But here's where it gets interesting. Even with freehold, the state retains certain rights. And with leasehold, there's this thing called a land betterment charge, or LBC, which can really impact the cost of development.
LBC, that sounds interesting. We'll have to unpack that in detail. And what about those temporary occupation licenses, or TOLs? What are those all about?
TOLs are like temporary passes for using state land. Think pop-up events, exhibitions, even temporary roads. They're usually granted for a maximum of 3 years and can be useful for developers.
So it's like a short-term lease for specific purposes.
Precisely. Now, here's a key point. Both freehold and leasehold land can actually revert back to the state under certain circumstances.
Wait, even freehold? That seems a bit counterintuitive.
It's true. If the lease expires on a leasehold property, the land goes back to the state. And even with freehold, if the landowner breaks the rules of the State Lands Act, the state can reclaim the land.
Wow, so there are limitations even with freehold ownership. It's like a constant reminder that the state ultimately controls the land in Singapore.
Exactly. And this leads us to the fascinating and sometimes controversial topic of land acquisition, where the state can acquire land for public purposes even if the owner doesn't want to sell.
That's some serious power. It highlights that delicate balance between private ownership and public interest. when it comes to land in Singapore?
It's a topic that often sparks debate, but understanding the legal framework is crucial for anyone in the real estate industry.
We've gone from the big picture of scarcity and demand to the intricacies of legal ownership and land acquisition. I'm starting to see why a solid grasp of these concepts is so important for aspiring salespeople.
It's all about building a strong foundation. Now, are you ready to dive deeper into those legal concepts we talked about?
Absolutely. Let's unravel those mysteries of easements, covenants, and those legal red flags caveats.
Let's do it.
All right, so we're back for more Singapore property talk law. Last time we talked about what makes Singapore property so special, the different types you can find, and some key things to know about investing. Now I'm ready to dive into the legal stuff. You mentioned easements, covenants, and caveats. Those sound kind of scary.
I know they sound like a lawyer's dream, but honestly, they're not that complicated once you break them down. And trust me, understanding these is super important for anyone dealing with Singapore property, especially if you're studying for that salesperson exam.
Okay, so let's start with easements. What are those all about?
Imagine you found this amazing house with a gorgeous garden, but the only way to get to it is through your neighbor's land. That's where an easement comes in. It basically gives one landowner the right to use a part of their neighbor's land for a specific reason.
So it's like a legal right-of-way.
Exactly. Easements can cover all sorts of things, like driveways, paths, even rights to light, air drainage, or even support for a building. They're usually officially recorded on the property titles, which means they apply to future owners, too.
So it's not just a casual agreement between neighbors, it's a serious legal thing that stays with the property.
You got it. It's all about making sure property owners can fully use and enjoy their land, even if it means working things out with their neighbors.
Makes sense. Okay, so what about covenants? How are those different from easements?
Think of covenants as promises made in a deed, usually about how a property can or can't be used. They're like a set of rules attached to the property to maintain a certain feel or quality in a neighborhood.
So a covenant might say you can't build a skyscraper or you can't open a certain type of business on the property.
Exactly. They can help keep an area looking nice and make sure neighboring properties are used in ways that work well together, which can actually help property values and keep everyone happy.
Like a neighborhood agreement, but with some legal muscle.
And just like easements, covenants are passed on to new owners, too.
So you really need to understand these restrictions before buying or selling.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about those legal red flags caveats.
Caveats sound serious. What are we talking about here?
Imagine you found your dream place, you've signed all the paperwork, but the deal is not done yet. Then you hear the seller's trying to sell it to someone else. That's where a caveat comes in.
So it's like a way to protect your claim on the property before you officially own it.
Exactly. It's basically a notice filed with the Singapore Land Authority, SLA, to protect an interest in a property that hasn't been registered yet. It stops the seller from selling to someone else while your deal is still going through.
Sounds like a pretty important tool for buyers.
It is, but other people can lodge caveats too, like creditors or people who are supposed to inherit property to protect their interests.
So before you buy anything, you really need to check if there are any caveats on the property.
Absolutely. Checking the title thoroughly can uncover any hidden issues or claims that might affect your ownership rights.
Okay, let's change gears a bit and talk about zoning and plot ratios. Those sound like pretty important concepts for understanding how Singapore manages its development.
They are. Zoning is basically the rule book for how land can be used in Singapore. It's how the government makes sure different areas are developed in a balanced and sustainable way.
So different zones for different purposes, residential, commercial, industrial, and so on.
Exactly. That's where the master plan comes in. It's like a blueprint for the city's future, guiding how Singapore will develop over the next 10 to 15 years.
So it shows developers what they can and can't build in specific areas.
Exactly. And it's reviewed every 5 years to keep it in line with Singapore's changing needs.
Makes sense. A city like Singapore needs a plan that can adapt. Now, what about plot ratios? They sound a bit more technical.
Plot ratios are all about how much you can build on a plot of land. It's a ratio that compares the total floor area of a building to the size of the land it sits on.
So a higher plot ratio means you can build taller and pack more into the same space.
You got it. Which is super important in a land-scarce country like Singapore. We have to use our limited land efficiently.
So if the master plan says an area is for residential use with a plot ratio of 2.8, a developer could build a 28-story building on a 10,000 square meter plot.
That's the basic idea. But it's not always that simple. Things like height restrictions, green spaces, and design guidelines for the area also come into play.
So it's a bit of a puzzle for developers trying to make the most of the land while still following the rules.
Exactly. And that's where the Urban Redevelopment Authority, URA, comes in. They look at all the development applications and make sure everything aligns with the master plan and other guidelines.
So the URA is like the guardian of Singapore's urban landscape, making sure everything develops in a way that makes sense.
You could say that. They have a big role in shaping how the city looks and functions in the future.
All this talk about zoning and plot ratios is interesting, but how does it actually affect the types of properties we see in Singapore? Those landed houses, condos, HDB flats?
That's a great question. Let's start with landed properties, especially those good class bungalows, GCBs. Did you know they have to follow really specific planning rules? For example, a GCB needs a minimum plot size of 1,400 square meters, and the house can only cover a maximum of 35% of that.
So you can't build a mega mansion on a small GCB plot. It's about keeping those spaces large and exclusive.
Exactly. And those rules are what keep those areas so prestigious and valuable. Other landed properties like semi-detached and terrace houses also have minimum plot size requirements to make sure there's enough space and privacy.
So even with landed property zoning and plot ratios play a big role in what gets built. What about non-landed profit properties like condos?
Condos are where things get really interesting. They're often built on sites with higher plot ratios, especially in central locations. That's why we see those tall condo buildings all over the city.
Makes sense. Developers want to make the most of the land, especially in prime areas. But wouldn't a higher plot ratio also mean more crowding and put a strain on things like transport and amenities?
It's definitely a balancing act for the URA. They have to weigh the benefits of more housing against the impact on the environment and infrastructure.
So it's not just about building higher, it's about making sure people can actually live comfortably in those spaces.
Exactly. Good planning means finding a good balance between density and livability. Now, when it comes to HDB flats, things are a bit different.
I'm guessing HDB developments have their own set of rules since they're part of the public housing program?
You're right. HDB towns are planned as self-contained communities with a mix of housing types, amenities, and public spaces. The focus is on affordable quality housing for Singaporeans, so the planning is different from private developments.
So it's less about making money and more about creating a good living environment that people can afford.
Exactly. HDB towns have a unique feel with those void decks community centers and a strong sense of community.
It's really impressive how HDB has shaped Singapore's social fabric.
It shows how important good planning is and how committed the government is to affordable housing.
We've talked a lot about the master plan and how it controls zoning and development, but how does Singapore actually make sure developers follow the rules? What's stopping them from building whatever they want?
That's where development applications and planning permissions come in. If a developer wants to build something, they have to submit a detailed application to the URA outlining their plans and showing how they meet the master plan requirements.
So every new development goes through a strict check to make sure it fits the overall vision for the city.
Exactly. The URA looks at each application very carefully, considering things like the impact on the environment, traffic, and the overall character of the area.
It sounds like a pretty thorough process, but what if a developer wants to change the approved plans? Can they just do whatever they want during construction?
Not at all. They need to apply for permission to change the use or make changes to the building. The URA will then check if those changes are okay. There are rules in place to make sure everything is done transparently and developers are held accountable.
So there are consequences for breaking the rules?
Absolutely. The URA can take action against developers who violate the regulations, including fines and even demolition orders.
Wow, that's serious. It shows they're serious about keeping the planning system fair and effective.
It's about maintaining a balance between development and sustainability, making sure Singapore continues to grow in a way that benefits everyone.
This has been super insightful. We've gone from understanding the basics of zoning and plot ratios to seeing how they actually work, shaping the types of properties we see and influencing the character of our neighborhoods.
It's amazing how all these concepts are connected, and it shows just how important good planning and development control are in creating a city that works well and is a great place to live.
Now, before we move on, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier. You said that even freehold land can be taken back by the state. Can you explain that a bit more? When could that happen? Okay, so we're back for the final stretch of Singapore property talk law. We've covered so much ground already, right? From how unique Singapore's property market is to all the different types of properties and what drives supply and demand. But I got to ask, what other interesting tidbits can you share to help our listeners ace that real estate salesperson exam?
We've definitely talked about the big picture, but there are some fascinating details within each topic that are worth digging into. Let's zoom in on a few specifics, starting with those GCBs, the creme de la creme of landed properties in Singapore.
Ah, yes, those good class bungalows. They're like the ultimate real estate dream, super exclusive and prestigious. What sets them apart besides their crazy price tags?
GCBs are not just about size and luxury. They have this unique set of planning restrictions that go beyond the usual guidelines for landed properties. For example, did you know you can't subdivide a GCB into smaller plots?
Really? So you can't just buy a huge GCB plot and split it up into a bunch of mini mansions?
Nope. That rule is there to keep those areas spacious and low density. It's all about maintaining that feeling of grandeur and exclusivity.
Wow, that's interesting. It's like a secret rule that protects these prestigious neighborhoods. So what other quirks and regulations apply to GCBs?
Another interesting one is the restriction on basements. Unlike other landed properties, GCBs can't have basements that extend beyond the footprint of the house. It's meant to prevent too much digging and protect the surrounding landscape.
So it's about striking a balance between using the land efficiently and preserving the natural beauty of the area.
Exactly. And then there's the bungalow belt rule we talked about earlier, which limits GCB development to specific prime areas, mainly in districts 10, 11, 20, and 21. That adds to their exclusivity too.
So it's not just about having enough money to buy a GCB. You also need to find one in the right location and navigate all those special rules. It's a whole different world.
It is, and that's what makes them so desirable. They're more than just houses. They're like trophies, a symbol of success and status.
Okay, well, I'm officially adding owning a GCB to my budget list. Now let's switch gears to HDB flats for a second. We know they're the foundation of affordable housing in Singapore. But what are some lesser-known facts or policies that aspiring salespeople should keep in mind?
HDB flats are a unique world with a whole system of policies and regulations to keep them affordable and allocate them fairly. One interesting concept is the Ethnic Integration Policy, or EIP. It actually influences who can buy and sell HDB flats in certain blocks or neighborhoods.
The EIP, I've heard of it, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how it works. Can you break it down for us?
The EIP is there to encourage racial harmony and prevent the formation of ethnic enclaves. It sets limits on the percentage of households from different ethnic groups in each HDB block and precinct.
So there are rules in place to ensure a balanced mix of residents. It's not just a free-for-all when it comes to buying and selling HDB flats.
Exactly, and this can affect everything from resale prices to who's eligible to buy or sell. For example, if a block already has a lot of families from a particular ethnic group, people from that same group might have a harder time buying there.
Wow, that's really interesting. It adds a whole other level of complexity to the HDB market.
It does, and it highlights how social factors play a role in Singapore's housing policies.
Okay, I'm starting to see why understanding the HDB market inside and out is so important for salespeople. There's so much more to it than you might think.
Absolutely. Now let's change gears again and talk about commercial properties. Let's focus on those strata titles you mentioned earlier. They're common in condos, but they apply to some commercial developments too.
Strata titles, they give you ownership of a specific unit in a larger development, right? Like owning a piece of the pie.
That's a perfect way to describe it. With a strata title, you own your individual unit, but you also share ownership of the common areas, like hallways, lifts, gardens, and facilities.
So it's like a mix of individual and shared ownership.
Exactly. And with that shared ownership comes responsibilities. Strata title owners pay maintenance fees to a management corporation, which takes care of all the common areas.
So it's like a mini democracy within the development, with owners working together to manage their shared spaces.
That's a great way to think about it. It's important for salespeople to understand how strata titles work, especially when dealing with commercial properties where there's a lot more at stake.
So if I'm advising a client on buying a shop unit in a commercial development with strata titles, I need to consider things like maintenance fees rules about using common areas and how decisions are made by the management corporation.
Absolutely. Those are all things that can affect the value and potential profit of the investment.
This is awesome. We've gone from those super luxurious GCBs to the details of HDB policies, and now the ins and outs of strata titles in commercial properties. Singapore's real estate market is so diverse and fascinating.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. There's always something new to discover, and that's what keeps things interesting.
I couldn't agree more. Now, as we wrap up, I want to touch on something that's really important for aspiring salespeople: ethics and professionalism. What are some guiding principles that should shape how they interact with clients and conduct business?
That's such an important point. Ethics are essential in any profession, but even more so in real estate. You're working with people's dreams, their hopes, and their life savings.
So it's not just about closing deals and making money. It's about building trust and doing what's best for your clients.
Exactly. Honesty, integrity, and transparency are key. Salespeople should always be upfront about potential risks and conflicts of interest and never pressure clients into anything they're not comfortable with.
It's about being a trusted advisor, not just a salesperson.
Right, and it's about understanding the impact your actions can have on people's lives. A home is much more than just a property. It's where memories are made, families grow, and dreams come true.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It reminds us that we're not just dealing with bricks and mortar, we're dealing with people's lives and their hopes for the future.
Exactly, and that's a huge responsibility.
Well said. Well, this has been an incredible journey into the world of Singapore real estate. We've covered so much, from the unique aspects of the market to all the different property types, the forces of supply and demand, the legal framework, and the importance of being ethical. I feel much more confident about tackling that real estate salesperson exam now.
That's great to hear. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more you know about this dynamic and constantly changing market, the better prepared you'll be to succeed.
Thanks for joining us on Singapore Property Talk Law, your guide to navigating the exciting world of Singapore real estate. We'll be back with more insights and expert advice in the future. Until then, happy studying.